It's always very difficult to predict the future, but what I see more and more is that creativity is certainly very important. And I think and how to improve creativity is very tricky business. The other thing that I sense is going to be more important is collaboration with people of different groups. That also implies that students that are fairly broad in their technological background may become increasingly important. For example, in my own work, more now than ever before, I find that the research I do that I consider the best usually involves collaboration with other groups. I'm doing experiments at the Advanced Photon Source at Argonne National Laboratory, a synchrotron. We do synchrotron microbeam work, but it turns out I bring a certain set of skills to that experiment, but it would be impossible for me to understand the very sophisticated X-ray instrumentation and X-ray diffraction that goes on in that experiment. So it's a group of sometimes as many as 8 persons getting together to perform some good work. I think we're going to see more and more of that in the years ahead. What that means is that people are going to have to increasingly be broad and have the ability to collaborate with other groups. So interpersonal skills, broadening of skills, and imagination are going to be very, very important, more so than ever before, I suspect. I remember when I was a student and then later a practicing engineer, a professor, is that sometimes the students that always got all A's, that seemed very smart when they were in the classroom, they could pick up things faster or as fast as anyone else. But what was curious is that many of these very bright students, that if you explained something to them, they'd understand it right away. But when they did research on their own, for some reason, it could never go anywhere. They could never go through the process of identifying an important scientific question or problem, and then going through a strategy or proposing a strategy that will allow them to get those answers. I'm not sure how I would call that skill. It might be a form of creativity, but they couldn't go through the process of research, actually executing science. So I always found that very curious. And I remember talking to an old professor of mine, and his name was Morris Fine. He's an emeritus professor at Northwestern University, and he said that he and a psychology professor did a study that tried to correlate grades with the quality of research a student eventually produced, and they found not a strong correlation. So that there's skills associated with executing research that are disparate from the skills in the classroom that might be associated, for example, with more classic definitions of intelligence. I remember when I was young, say 8, 9 years old, I always was very interested in hands-on science issues. I was less interested in the classroom, but actually doing scientific kinds of experiments, playing with microscopes, doing experiments that involve buoyancy. I think those students that are involved very hands-on, for which there's a more personal relationship with science, often perhaps do better later on. They've developed at an early age the kinds of skills that become very useful to scientists later on. You know, I had a disadvantage. It was done on my own. At the same time, I had an advantage. For example, the microscope I got when I was 9 years old was sort of handed to me by my parents, and it was one of the most fascinating things I'd ever gotten. I was just perpetually putting things underneath the microscope. I remember one thing that came with the microscope was shrimp eggs, which we could hatch with time, and I would watch these microscopic shrimps. But I'd always basically put everything I could find in the universe underneath the microscope at some point. So I didn't have any advantage of someone sort of mentoring me, but rather I did everything on my own. And I think sometimes that can be a little bit of an advantage as well. Being able to have your mind work completely freely for periods of time. But again, I have to thank my parents. I think we all need someone in our lives that is going to give us some help, give us some things that'll stimulate a scientific interest. We have lots of good scientists. We've supported many great scientists. For example, the important progress the Navy made was done by having expert research done on precision timekeeping. For example, there's Dr. Phillips at NIST, who was supported by ONR to work on the Zeeman effect, which was laser cooling of atoms that allows us to have very precise timekeeping, which enabled the GPS that all of us have in our cars. That was very important to the Navy. It was very important to precision timekeeping, but it's had a very wide application. That was one of our Nobel Prize winners. We had a recent Nobel Prize winner that we supported in the United Kingdom. We don't just support scientists in the United States. The Navy in particular supports scientists overseas. A recent Nobel Prize was to Andre Geim, and that was for this new material called graphene, which may hold a great deal of promise for a new generation of high-density integrated circuits. We've also supported a professor at Caltech for femtosecond work. That was Ahmed Zuel. So we support a lot of great scientists, and we always will. One thing that always strikes me about these great scientists is that they're extraordinarily personable. These are among the most humble people I've met. They're fantastic people personally, and the work they did had such an impact on technological progress. You can't help but admire them extraordinarily. I think there are always important problems to be solved. I can talk about some of those problems the Navy is specifically interested. For example, we have their new frontiers in which the Office of Naval Research is quite interested. Some of those areas include like autonomous systems, robotics. These is going to be an important area, I think, for a lot of persons. It's going to be particularly important for the Navy, probably the Department of Defense as well. The other thing we're interested in is advanced computing. We're investing in quantum computing. We're interested in secure communications. And that's not so hard to imagine that the Department of Defense is interested in secure communication. And that could mean quantum communications for secure communications. We're also interested in things like the cognitive sciences. In the military, we do a lot of training, like a lot of people do, like a lot of companies, like the educational community does. But we're very interested in how people learn. And what we're interested in learning is how can we take what we know about how humans learn and then maybe have inexpensive digital tutors. For example, we train so many people per year in the Navy. We'd like to train them as cost efficiently and as effectively as possible. If we understand how the human mind works, we might be able to have computers mimic a tutor. Some of the most effective learning is done by tutors, but we can't have every sailor, every Marine have a private tutor, but we might get close. And we might get close by understanding the cognitive behavior of the human brain and coupling that with expert tutors and putting them into a computer program that readjusts the training regimen based on the responses by the student. So that's another area in which there's a lot of research. We're interested in improving manufacturing. For example, the Department of Defense and the Navy acquires lots of equipment, as you might imagine. And we're interested in having the American manufacturing community be expert at manufacturing materials, for example. So we're interested in computation integrated material science. Those are things that are very important to us. STEM education is extremely important to the Navy. What we know, for example, in the Navy, we're concerned with defense of the United States. We also know in the Navy that the quality of our defense is going to depend on technology. Technology and national defense are absolutely hand in hand. So we have an interest in investing in Americans so that they have the opportunity to go into science and become great scientists, which will benefit the United States in general, but also the Department of Defense, also the United States Navy. What we also know is that for our men and women in the Navy and the Marine Corps, that the equipment they use is getting increasingly complicated. In other words, we need well-trained sailors and Marines to operate increasingly very sophisticated equipment. So we want our sailors and Marines to have the best technology. We don't want to have them ever face an adversary who has technological superiority, and we want to make sure that they personally have had the training, the personal tools to be able to operate very sophisticated equipment. This means that the Navy, the Department of Defense, has an enormous responsibility towards investing in science and technology and in our people, or in our citizens that become sailors and Marines and also eventually support the scientific infrastructure in this country. What we know in the Navy is that we read what's going on in the rest of the country, and recently the President's Council of Advisors for Science and Technology, PCAST, indicated that there will be a shortage of about 1 million qualified scientists and engineers over the next 10 years. We see the same issue. For example, we see that we will have a shortfall in the Navy of qualified scientists and engineers. So what we see as the President's Council of Advisors in Science and Technology observe is that there will be a shortage, and we have to act now to make sure that the Navy itself will have enough scientists and engineers to man its workforce, and the country as a whole. So the Navy has a direct interest in making sure that national security is provided by our investments in our people in the science and technology area. We see this shortage. The other thing that the Navy sees is that if you look at our high school graduates in the United States, about 30% of high school graduates are white males. They look like me. But if you look at bachelors in engineering, and the Navy has a particular interest in engineering, of the civilian workforce in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, the far majority are in engineering fields. But if we look at engineering graduates, bachelors in engineering, about 70% are white males. So you go from 30% of the general population, high school graduates, to 70%. So there's an attrition or a leakage or a lack of engagement by African Americans, Hispanics, and women. So for our STEM programs that are geared towards the middle school, which is a critical area, we particularly have focused on often on those communities, such as the ones Iridescent engages in South Central Los Angeles, in New York, those communities that have significant fractions of underrepresented persons, poorer persons, Hispanics, African Americans, and of course Iridescent, which we agree with them, is investing heavily in science education for women. These three groups are not properly represented inasmuch as the Navy and the country faces a shortage of scientists and engineers in the future. We have to pay particular attention to those groups that are particularly underrepresented. That's where there may be the effective mining for engineers and scientists for the future. We think in the Navy, computer science is very important for us. It's one of the STEM fields. And we also believe that women are not participating in science and engineering enough. We think that women should be specifically targeted because there is a particular attrition in women engaging science starting at the middle school. And some people think it might even start a little bit earlier than that. The important challenge is, as we invest in the middle school, will be metrics. I think in the Navy, as we spend money on STEM, there's going to be increasing pressure to validate our investment. We're going to need metrics, see if we're getting the taxpayers' money worth, basically. So the ideas that I've put forward in terms of what I think the Navy can be doing in STEM has to be followed by an assessment as to whether our payoffs is really there. I think in the case of middle school, we may not know if the payoff is there for some time. So I think the challenge is going to be, one of the challenges is going to be is effective metrics. In other words, I think our scholars are doing a good job in identifying important new strategies to engage students, particularly underrepresented students, but this has to be followed by an assessment of which strategies are working. We can't just try a strategy and then walk away from it. We have to assess whether that strategy is being effective. We don't really know yet what's going to work best, so we're going to have to go through the discipline, and sometimes this will take years, of discovering which processes are going to be more effective at retaining students in science and technology areas. Yeah, the reason the Navy works with Iridescent is because as best we could assess the state-of-the-art in STEM education, Iridescent was at the state-of-the-art. They did several things that we thought were important. These may change, the strategies may change in the future, but currently, for example, they're very hands-on. That's very important. If students are brought into a large lecture hall and get a lecture, that STEM outreach tends to be less effective based on the studies that we've seen. So Iridescent is hands-on. What Iridescent also does is try to bring in near-peer mentors. Their students, their teachers tend to have a small age difference between the student and the teacher. Also, it's a family science project for some of their projects where the parents come in. And the studies seem to indicate that if you can get the parents involved in the outreach effort, in the science education effort, the chances for success are higher. So we've invested in Iridescent because it was a modern state-of-the-art. The Navy invests a fair amount in STEM, but we're very careful to whom we give funds. We get a lot of proposals, and we choose those proposals that appear consistent with Navy needs, quite frankly, and also that are at the state-of-the-art, that are the most meritorious proposals. So we've been very happy with Iridescent. Also, Iridescent had outreach to groups that were had high attrition rates in science and engineering. These would be women, these would be minorities. They would also be people in poor neighborhoods. Recently, Iridescent started a science center at Hunts Point in the Bronx. I was told, I'd have to verify it, but that Hunts Point is the poorest congressional district in the United States, living in the shadow of Manhattan. So the Navy has tried to go to those underserved areas where we think that if we can make improvements, there could be dramatic interest on middle school students and high school students in science and engineering. This could reap the benefits of a dramatic increase in students, particularly from minorities, that enter into science and engineering, and help fill that gap that the President's Council Advisors for Science and Technology project is going to be dramatic over the next 10 years.